everyone, these are my Lizard Queen dolls. I'm going to share my process with you today. This isn't a tutorial, it's just a quick video to show you how I make them. I start off with my paper pattern. I have most of the pattern pieces cut out here. There's a few pieces that I do not make patterns for, I just eyeball them. So here's the fabric I'm going to be using. I love it. This is my last piece, unless I have some tucked away I forgot about. I'm going to put my pattern pieces on my fabric and then trace around them with my fancy fluff ball pen here. I'm just using a straight edge to draw out the pattern piece that I don't have on paper because it's just a long skinny triangle. And when I trace these, I have to be really careful about where I'm placing them on the fabric because I have such a little piece to work with. So small pieces like the arms, I'm tracing on this oddball little shaped scrap of fabric. And I have to make sure that I flip each of my pattern pieces over so that I get a mirror image for both sides so I can sew them together later. Now that I have traced all of my pattern pieces, I'm going to just rough cut around each one, and then I will trim them up nice and neat later, leaving a small amount of seam allowance outside of my pen lines. In the middle of this, the fluff ball fell off of my fancy pen, but because I am a hoarder, responsible, eco-conscious crafter, I'll keep that to use later. Here I am showing off all of my pieces that I have now cut out and pinned together. I will lay these all out. You can see I've got a matching mirror image piece for every piece. The body's a little more complicated because there's a side piece and a front and back piece for that will go together later. I'm missing one of those pieces here. Here they all are sewn together. I've sewn them by hand, which takes hours and is really hard to do on the camera. So you can see I've left a gap here so that I can stuff this. I first have to turn it. I'm using these little sticks and tubes. It's a turning tool set so that I can turn those long skinny pieces right side out. Then I have to use my stick to kind of push out the tiny details like the foot. This is an oddball foot. It's kind of inspired by a chameleon foot, which kind of has a long front and back. I don't know if you'd call them a claw or a toe. Now it's time for stuffing. I'm using polyester stuffing. I'm going to get those long tools I was using earlier to turn the pieces right side out, and I'll use those to start pushing small pieces of fabric down into the small areas like the toes first. Sometimes I have to switch it up and use an even smaller tool to get the stuffing into the very ends of the tiny pieces like the toes or the thumbs. Then I'll repeat that process about 100 more times until I have all the different pieces for my doll firmly stuffed. When I'm done, I still have that little opening I left so I could turn and stuff it that I'll need to sew back closed. I'm using a stitch here called a ladder stitch, which is a great way to close up a seam like this in a way that your stitches will not be visible when you're done. Sometimes that stuffing kind of wants to pop back out that hole as I'm sewing, so I just got to keep tucking it back in there. And sometimes when I'm all done, I'll even have some little fibers of stuffing sticking out that hole, and I just have to trim those off when I'm all done. Here are all the pieces after I've finished sewing them. The arms and the legs are separate pieces that I will sew on later. I'm just going to sew the legs straight onto the body. They're not going to move. And with the tail, that kind of gives her a tripod that she can stand up with on her own if I don't have a doll stand, though she's more sturdy in a doll stand. Next, I'm going to sew on her arms, but I'm going to do those a little bit differently. I'm going to give her what's called button joints, so I'll use a plastic button on both sides of her shoulders. I'm using very sturdy upholstery thread for this, and I'll start by tying a knot to one of the buttons and firmly anchoring it. Then I'm going to use this extra long needle that is actually made for doll making, and I will put that through one of the arms, all the way straight through the body. Then I'll put the needle through the second arm and add the second button. And then I will stitch back and forth all the way across the body several times, pulling the thread very, very tight. The buttons are there to keep the fabric itself from tearing because I want to have enough tension in this thread so that the arms will stay put if I want to put them up. This lets her put her arms up and down and gives her some posability. I'm going to use these beads for her eyes. They look like they're black, but they're actually a very, very dark blue with a very subtle shimmer to them if you get them in the light just right. So I really love using those for eyes. They came from our dearly departed Joanne Fabrics, so I'm not sure where to get these beads anymore, sadly. I'm going to sew these on very similar to how I sewed on the arms. I'm going to put a bead on either side of the head and just sew straight through her head, through each bead several times, pulling them tight. This will actually give a little bit of shape to the head as well. You might have noticed when I first put the needle through the head where the eyes were going to be placed, I looked at the face from the front and the top so that I could make sure my needle was lined up nicely on both sides of the face before I added the beads. The next thing I'm going to do is give her a little bit of shape to her nose. I'm going to give her some nostrils. So I'm going to take that needle and sew through both sides of her nose to give her nose some shape. I'm not pulling quite as tightly here because I don't have the beads or buttons to keep the fabric from tearing if I pull too hard. So here she is with her eyes and her nose. Her face is all done. And next, I just need to decide what outfit she's going to have.